On May 7th, 1915, RMS Lusitania, bound for the city of Liverpool from New York City, was torpedoed and sunk by German U-boat U-20. And while the sinking of the Lusitania wasn't the main thing that would get the US involved in World War I, it was a significant factor. Now, the Lusitania sank not too far from Ireland's southern coastline, around 13 miles or so. So because of this, the ocean depths at the site where the ship sank is nowhere near as deep as, say, where the Titanic went down. Titanic is roughly 2.5 miles underwater, while Lusitania is only 300 feet or so. However, despite this, there is a massive difference in the condition between the two wrecks today. The Titanic is still somewhat recognizable. I mean, you can look at the bow section of Titanic, at least, and go, oh, hey, that's Titanic. But it's the opposite with Lusitania. Lusitania looks like nothing more than a big, huge, jumbled up pile of metal at the bottom of the ocean. And if you didn't know what ship you were looking at, honestly, I'd be surprised if you could tell it was Lusitania. But why is this the case? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring in today's video. I hope you enjoy. Special thanks to Titanic Honor and Glory for providing the sinking animation you're going to see in today's video. Please check out their work in the description below. Now, the first reason as to why the condition of the Lusitania is so different compared to Titanic is due to the fact that the Lusitania was torpedoed. You see, when this torpedo detonated, the explosion did a huge amount of damage to the structure of the Lusitania itself. And then a few seconds after the torpedo strike, another second explosion ripped through the ship from an unknown source, but we've mostly confirmed that it was either a boiler or a steam line detonating. So both of these explosions combined did a massive amount of damage to the ship's structure, and while it wouldn't be immediately apparent during the sinking, it would affect how the wreck would deteriorate in the years to come. You see, areas on a ship that were more structurally damaged during a sinking deteriorate much more quickly than areas that weren't. We can get a prime example of this just from looking at the wreck of the Titanic. If we look at the bow section of Titanic, at least the forward parts anyway, you can see that this area where it wasn't that badly structurally damaged, it's in very good condition. It still looks like Titanic. However, the further aft we go on the bow section, the closer we get to the breakup, well, this area was massively structurally compromised by the sinking and breaking into, that it's deteriorated much more quickly. The stern section of the Titanic, well, this whole area was structurally compromised by the sinking, so it barely resembles what it did today on the surface. The entire stern section is very similar to the Lusitania wreck. It's all collapsed and fallen apart, and it barely even resembles the stern today. Now, the damage to Lusitania wasn't limited to just what was caused by these two explosions we discussed earlier. In fact, the entire sinking did so much damage to the ship that I honestly have a hard time putting into words how serious it was. You see, when the Lusitania was struck by the torpedo, the ship was traveling at roughly 18 knots. And after the detonation, the ship lost steam pressure so quickly that the crew did not have time to slow the ship down and stop it. They simply had to wait for the Lusitania to coast to a stop. The forward momentum put even more water pressure on the opening in the hull, which allowed the sea to flood a lot more rapidly. The water was basically exploding its way into the Lusitania's hull, destroying hallways, passageways, damaging the ship's structure as it went. I mean, it was an incredibly violent flooding. Now, once the Lusitania went into its final plunge, this is where the real damage to the ship's structure began. You see, when the Lusitania's bow slammed into the bottom of the ocean, it began to roll over onto its starboard side. However, where the ship's stern was still above the surface and it was still full of air, it tried to resist that turning motion of the bow. Because of this, it caused the ship's hull to flex and warp in an unnatural way, which caused a huge crack to begin to rip through the Lusitania's hull in between the ship's third and fourth funnel, and it went all the way through the ship. Now, the Lusitania would not break in two like what the Titanic did. However, the ship basically suffered another massive structural failure, and this would greatly accelerate the deterioration of the ship once she arrived at the bottom of the ocean. Now, over the next couple of decades, the only thing that would affect the wreck of the Lusitania in terms of deterioration is just the normal effects from the ship laying at the bottom of the ocean. And we know from looking at the Titanic how devastating this can be. However, don't forget, the Titanic and the Lusitania are at two drastically different depths. So while the deterioration of both ships is similar, it is a little bit different. For one thing, the wreck of the Lusitania, where it's at only 300 feet, there's a lot more oxygen in the water than what you find at the Titanic depths. The shallower the water, the more oxygen there is. So this would cause the ship to rust and corrode more quickly. However, there's also a lot more undersea life at Lusitania's depths than Titanic. So when all of this life starts to attach itself to the Lusitania's hull, it begins to restrict how much oxygen can reach the hull, so thus it would slow down the act of corrosion and rusting away. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, I guess you could say. Now, I'm sure all of you are thinking, wait, the Titanic isn't rusting away as quickly as Lusitania? What about all those big, crazy, like rusting-looking shapes that are all over the Titanic? Isn't that the rust? Well, no. You see, those big clumps that you see all over the Titanic wreck, well, these are called rusticles, and despite how they sound from the name, this isn't rust, so to speak. It's actually bacteria. Rusticles are bacteria that are covering the entire wreck of the Titanic, but they're more prominent in areas that have suffered massive structural damage, but these bacteria are eating the Titanic. So while the Titanic isn't really rusting away, at least not very fast, it is in fact being eaten by these bacteria. Now, there are bacteria similar to rusticles at shallower depths, like where the Lusitania is, but the reason the Lusitania isn't covered in them like the Titanic is due to the fact that there's so much more undersea life on the wreck of the Lusitania than there is at the Titanic's depths. A lot of life just can't survive down there. So all of this additional undersea life is competing with this iron-eating bacteria for resources. So due to this, the Lusitania is simply not being eaten away like the Titanic is. So now that all of you have a general understanding of some of the natural processes that are decaying the wreck of the Lusitania, I'm sure you've come to realize that it doesn't possibly explain all of the damage the wreck has sustained since she went down. If you compare the wreck of the Lusitania to another shipwreck, more specifically the HMHS Brittanic, which sank a little over a year after Lusitania, well, Brittanic is at a similar depth to Lusitania, just being around 100 feet or so deeper, but it is in way better condition than Lusitania today. If you look at the Lusitania and the Brittanic side by side, well, as I stated earlier, Lusitania is nothing more than a pile of metal at the bottom of the ocean, while the Brittanic still looks like the Brittanic. The hull is intact, and it still looks like the ship, just resting on its starboard side. Why is this the case? Well, it comes down to one big factor: human intervention. Yes, you heard me right. Human intervention is the reason why the Lusitania is in such bad shape. But to fully explain why, we first need to go over some of the history of the many dives that have occurred at the wreck of the Lusitania since the ship went down. So, where the Lusitania sank not too far from land, it wouldn't take very long for the wreck to be discovered, around 20 years or so. The wreck was officially discovered on October 6, 1935. Now, the Lusitania was a big target, even back then, for shipwreck divers and salvage teams, because there were all of these stories floating around out there about the wreck of the Lusitania, saying that the ship contained gold, priceless diamonds, incredibly valuable works of art. And even then, there were conspiracy theories around this ship. Why did the ship sink so fast? What was the second explosion? Was the British government involved in a cover-up with the Lusitania? These were questions that everyone wanted to answer, and so it made the ship a big target for those that would want to dive and try to salvage the ship. Now, only a few weeks after the wreck of the Lusitania was discovered, the first dive on this ship was made. Yes, you heard me right. Just a few weeks later, a man by the name of Jim Jarrett became the first man to dive Lusitania. He did this by using this giant steel suit that weighed around 1,000 pounds. Holy crap. And you see, the suit maintained 1 atmosphere of pressure inside, which would allow Jim to go down to the wreck of the Lusitania, and before you ask, the suit was more than capable of withstanding the pressures down there. It would allow Jim to explore the ship for a limited amount of time, and then come back up to the surface without having to deal with decompression. The suit worked fine, Jim explored the ship, and yeah, he became the first man in history to see the liner since she went down. Now, I didn't see any record that Jim actually recovered any artifacts from the Lusitania. If I had to guess, I would say he did not. But after he found the wreck and had a successful dive on the wreck, other teams began to work rapidly to try to figure out the easiest way to salvage what they could from the sunken liner. There was this other company a couple of years later that had the idea to build this giant steel tube that had a staircase in it, and then they would lower this tube down to the wreck of the Lusitania and literally rest the tube on the Lusitania's hull, and then men could walk down the stairs in the tube, get into a dive chamber at the bottom, and then simply step outside and be on the wreck of the Lusitania. This company went as far as actually building and testing the tube, but financial troubles kept this company from ever trying to use it on the wreck of the Lusitania, so yeah, nothing ended up happening with this idea. Now, even though things didn't work out with this tube staircase thing down to the Lusitania, there were other groups out there trying to figure out ways to effectively salvage the ship. However, World War II would put an end to all of that and effectively halt all further dives and salvage attempts to the Lusitania for quite a while. The world had more important things going on with the war than worrying about a ship that had sunk decades earlier. The only thing that would have affected the wreck's condition during the war and a little bit after would have been natural corrosion and depth charges. Now, there are conspiracies out there regarding the wreck of the Lusitania that states that the shipwreck was intentionally depth charged by the British Navy in order to hide evidence that the ship was carrying munitions. As far as I can tell, this is a complete lie. This never happened. Any people that say that it did, their accounts are inconsistent. Now, there have been depth charges found in the area of the Lusitania, and people like to point to these and go, see, this is evidence that the ship was bombed. But honestly, the area where the Lusitania sank was huge with U-boat activity in both world wars. So, I mean, there was so much stuff going on here that these depth charges could have accidentally, went off or been dropped just by sheer chance in the vicinity of the Lusitania. So, if the wreck was ever bombed, so to speak, by a depth charge, then it was purely accidental. The British Navy never targeted the Lusitania or intentionally tried to destroy the ship. And I will give more evidence for this when we talk about the dives that came after the war was over. Now, the next confirmed dive to the wreck of the Lusitania was done in the 1960s by a man named John Light. John Light made around 40 dives to the wreck of the Lusitania using nothing but compressed air to breathe. And if you know anything about diving, you'll know how incredibly risky this was. For those of you that don't know, oxygen becomes toxic when you go below a certain depth, and you have to breathe a collection of other gases to deal with this. But yeah, John didn't do this. He just went down and came back up using nothing but compressed air. Those on the surface said that every time he came back, he looked incredibly sick and pale. I don't blame him. Honestly, it's a miracle he survived this at all. Now, John also wanted to photograph the wreck of the Lusitania so he could show the condition of the ship to everybody who was up on the surface. He attempted to bring some light fixtures down there to try to light up the ship, but all of these lights were crushed by the pressure. He did reportedly take some photos of the wreck, however, I was unable to find them for this video, and if you do have any information about those, please let me know in the comments below. I would like to hear about it. One really cool thing that I did find from these dives is this incredible drawing of the wreck of the Lusitania that you're seeing on your screen right now. I'm not sure if John made this himself or if somebody who was a friend of his made this, but regardless, it shows the wreck of the Lusitania as it existed during John's dive, and it's incredible. I want you to pay very close attention to the condition of the ship. If you were on the surface and you were looking down at a shipwreck, well, if you saw this ship at the bottom, what would you think? I would obviously think, this is Lusitania. Yes, in the 1960s, you can tell the condition of the ship is nothing like what it is today. It's still clearly the Lusitania, so the ship hadn't deteriorated that much up to this current point. A few other interesting things of note. If you look just aft of the third funnel, you'll see a giant crack going through the Lusitania's hull. Well, this is where the ship nearly broke into during the sinking, that incident that we discussed earlier in this video. Another interesting thing is this hole that's directly in the middle of the ship. You see it circled in the photograph. I didn't put that circle in there. This was something that was put into the photograph at the time. John discovered this hole, and he said that it looked like somebody had used a welding device or something to cut a hole in the Lusitania's hull, or maybe they used some explosives to blast a hole into the ship. But anyway, he thought that this hole was made by a salvage team trying to get into the wreck of the Lusitania to recover stuff. However, here's the interesting thing about that. To this day, we do not know who made that hole or what exactly they were doing. However, as I'll explain in a little while, when salvage attempts were made on the Lusitania a couple of decades later, they discovered some pretty interesting pieces of the ship were missing. But as I said, more on that in a minute. Now, from what I could find, I didn't see any records that said that John recovered a large amount of artifacts from the wreck of the Lusitania during these dives. If he did, which honestly he probably did, they would have just been the occasional small little object here or there, nothing substantial. However, that doesn't mean that John didn't want to recover a large amount of stuff from the wreck. He ended up purchasing the entire wreck of the Lusitania for 1,000 pounds, and he wanted to launch a massive salvage expedition to the wreck to recover as much stuff from it as he could. He tried to get funding to launch this expedition, so in order to do that, he partnered with two other men named George McComa and Greg Bemis. But John ended up having a bunch of financial trouble, so he had to end up giving up his ownership of the wreck, which would eventually only leave George McComa and Greg Bemis in charge of the entire thing. They owned the wreck of the Lusitania, basically. Now, even though they had acquired the ship, not much would happen for quite a while. It was probably another decade or so before anything substantial would happen with this. Greg Bemis actually completely forgot that he owned half of the ship. However, all of that would change in the 1980s. So in the year 1982, Bemis began to develop a fascination with the wreck of the Lusitania. He wasn't just interested in it for the sake of money, as he was back when he first got involved with it a decade earlier. He wanted to learn more about the story of the ship. Why did she sink so fast? What was that second explosion? Was the British government involved in a cover-up? These were things that he really wanted to know. He was becoming a big Lusitania historian, I guess you could say. So anyway, he wanted to launch a new salvage expedition to, number one, recover artifacts from the ship, but he wanted to sell those artifacts to help fund more expeditions so that they could explore the wreck more thoroughly, and hopefully he could he could get the answers to these questions that he was curious about the wreck of the Lusitania. Now, Bemis went to McComa with his ideas for what to do with the wreck of the Lusitania, but McComa really was concerned about how expensive a project like this could become, and honestly, he didn't really want to be involved with it. So he decided to sell his shares of the wreck of the Lusitania to Bemis for the massive price of $1. Pretty crazy deal if you ask me. Anyway, Bemis then hired another group called the Oceanic Company to lead the salvage expeditions to the wreck. They went there twice, once in the year 1982 and another time in the year 1983, and they salvaged a bunch of stuff from the ship, some of which include the ship's anchors, a bridge telegraph. They even took 3 out of the 4 propellers from the wreck, and countless other things were recovered. So yeah, they were very busy down there, to say the least. Now, the Oceanic Company was far from gentle when they were recovering these artifacts from the wreck of the Lusitania. They went down there to get these things, and it seems like they really didn't care all that much about how much damage they did to the ship in the process. To remove 3 out of the 4 propellers from the Lusitania wreck, they literally used explosives and blew them off the ship, doing significant damage to the ship's stern in the process. They also got inside of the wreck, so this also implies that the hull was still in one piece up to this point, and they wanted to try to recover the safes from the purser's office. However, they discovered that the safes were gone. They were already gone. Now, remember earlier in this video, I talked about that hole that John found in the 1960s? Well, while we don't have any evidence of this, it seems to me that somebody pre-John's dives to the wreck in the 1960s got inside of the ship and took those safes out. That's a pretty crazy thing about the wreck, and it is still a mystery as to who took them to this day. Anyway, after the Oceanic Company was done taking stuff and literally destroying the wreck with everything that they were doing, the wreck basically sat there idle and no one really messed with it for the foreseeable future. The items that were recovered from the Lusitania were sold in auctions, and some of them are on displays in museums. The propellers, well, they definitely have an interesting story. One of the propellers is on display in front of a Hilton Hotel in Dallas, Texas, of all places. Another one is on display in front of a maritime museum in Liverpool. That one makes sense, at least. But now, the third propeller? Do you want to know what happened to that? Well, it's officially missing, but there are rumors out there that the thing was melted down and turned into golf clubs. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Now, it should go without saying that Oceaneering's company's actions did a huge amount of damage to the wreck, and after they left, the ship just continued to deteriorate more and more rapidly. Now, I'm not sure what Bemis's thoughts were on everything that was being done to the ship. It's quite possible he didn't know how drastically they were damaging it when they were working on this, but yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, nothing of substantial note would happen with the Lusitania wreck until 1993, when Robert Ballard visited the wreck. He noted how much the ship had deteriorated. There was a huge difference in the condition of the ship, between John's dives and when Robert Ballard visited it in the 90s. Huge difference. So, yeah, I mean, that's your answer right there. When you add up everything that happened to the wreck during the sinking, and then you factor in what these people did to the wreck in the 80s when they were salvaging it, well, it's no surprise that the ship has basically completely collapsed today. The more and more time goes by, the more the wreck of the Lusitania has deteriorated. And as I stated at the beginning of this video, the ship has only a handful of accessible areas in the inside left. Most of the ship's hull has completely collapsed and is just pancaked down at the bottom of the ocean. I really do wish they would have handled the wreck of the Lusitania like we handled the wreck of the Titanic today. The general consensus is we do not recover stuff from inside of the Titanic itself. The only items from the Titanic that were recovered were stuff that was thrown from the ship when it spiraled down to the bottom of the ocean. That's it. But we have done interior explorations of the Titanic wreck. But even just from exploring the Titanic's wreck, like just going inside and looking around with ROVs, we've damaged it. The submarines landing on top of the officers' quarters and on the deck and everything, those have damaged the Titanic. So, in conclusion, even though there's no way to reverse the damage that was done to the Lusitania, and I hate it, I hope that we can use this as a lesson. We can use what happened to that ship to not make this mistake again in the future, because shipwrecks, they're tombs. They're tombs, and they also tell a story. So when we go down there and we recover artifacts, and just to be clear, I'm not against recovering artifacts, but I think it should be done respectfully, because it's through recovering these artifacts that the stories of these shipwrecks and the people that were on them are told. But why should we destroy the wreck just to get artifacts? I hope I'm making sense. But yeah, anyway, guys, I hope that what happened to the Lusitania wreck never happens again, and that all future shipwrecks that we discover are treated with the respect that they deserve, so they can continue to tell their stories for future generations to enjoy. This is Stan from Historic Travels. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave it a like. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.